Welcome back to US History Lecture videos. I'm Mrs. Richardson. Today we're going to be talking about Ronald Reagan's presidency in the 1980s. You may have noticed that there were no teacher lectures on the 1970s, but instead there are some documentary options. So we've jumped from 1960s to 1980s with our teacher lecture. Today's specific goals explain Ronald Reagan's attitude towards the government and discuss his administration, economic policies, and the effects on the nation. So we're going to focus on the presidency of Ronald Reagan and the social changes of the 1980s. Cruising through time here, guys. So Ronald Reagan enters the White House in 1981 with a promise to change America. He appealed to voters that were worried about social change and America's power in the world, and he promised that conservative principles could fix the problems created by the previous generation, blaming big government and social reform programs for America's presidency. Reagan himself moved to California in 1937 to become a Hollywood actor, served as a reserve officer in the U.S. Army, and worked in the first motion picture unit during World War II. After the war, he became a leader in the Screen Actors Guild and a spokesman for General Electric. As a young man, he identified as a liberal Democrat, with a distaste for communism and influence from his wife, Nancy Davis, pushing him towards conservatism. And by 1962, he switched to the Republican Party and is elected as a conservative Republican. He promised to cut taxes and reduce big government when he ran for the governor of California. He blamed the Brown versus Board of Education case for race riots and student protests. He criticized tax increases and the growth of the state government with the goals of cutting taxes and reducing big government. He ended up, of course, in office actually approving the largest state budget in California's history and raised taxes multiple times because he learned once he was in office that many programs could not be eliminated. So he had political skill. He could capture the public mood but compromise when necessary. With the rise of his presidency was a rise of the new right, as it was referred to, in a big conservative movement. And this kind of came in response to the changes of the 1960s and 70s and sort of the hippie era and this sort of rise of rebellion against the conservative values. And after sort of that generation, we see after that generation comes up in protest against those conservative values, we also see a wave of a growth in the conservative movement in response to that. The group of the New Right included wealthy financial supporters and evangelical Christians, opposing things like the legalization of abortion, the feminist movement, and sex education in schools. They were often middle and working class people who resented government growth and taxes. And so this wave also supported his winning of the presidential election. Only 52% of eligible voters actually voted in 1980, which was the lowest turnout since 1948. And a lot of those who voted were older, whiter, and wealthier. And so Reagan won strong support among white voters, especially white, older, wealthy voters. He also won a Republican majority in the Senate. And this was a major shift and swing from the more democratic leaders of previous presidencies to the more conservative leaders. Reagan's economic policy was called Reaganomics by the press and was based on supply-side economics, which was doubted by many economists. So the president cut income taxes for wealthy people, hoping they would invest in businesses and factories, and that this would trickle down as jobs for working people. The theory promised that tax cuts would increase the total tax revenue even at lower rates. This was kind of referred to as the trickle-down economics, and critics argued that it would only help the rich. Even George H.W. Bush, Reagan's future vice president, called it voodoo economics. It was not very well supported. He proposed a 30% tax cut to be phased in over his first term, and Congress was initially resisting, worried that the cuts would only help wealthy people. So he used his skills to appeal directly to the American people. After surviving an assassination attempt in 1981, his popularity surged, and Congress passed the Economic Recovery Act, which phased in a 25% tax reduction over 3 years. The results of it, mixed outcome. He succeeded in cutting taxes but failed to reduce government spending. The number of federal employees actually increased during his presidency, and he reduced funding for anti-poverty programs like food stamps and Medicaid. But he left Social Security and Medicare largely untouched. In the early 1980s, there was a deep recession that hit the economy, unemployment reaching 10% and homelessness becoming a serious problem in American cities. So the economy did not do as well as he hoped. After that dip, economic growth resumed, growing slowly over the rest of his presidency. And by the end of his second term as president, unemployment had gone down to about 5.3%, but the nation was $3 trillion in debt. Increased defense spending and tax relief for wealthy families made it a balanced budget impossible. Real wages for average American families leveled off during the 1980s, and the weakening of labor unions contributed to wage stagnation, or no longer increasing wages, kind of remaining stuck. In 1981, federal air traffic controllers went on strike for better working conditions, and the president fired all 12,000 striking controllers. This action destroyed the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization and ushered in a new era where employees simply replaced striking workers. This is very different than previous presidents who had intervened and stepped in to regulate between big businesses and striking workers. In this case, the president sets a precedent of just firing them all. And following the president's example, other employers became more aggressive towards unions. And this contributed to the decline of union power and worker wages and rights for workers during the 1980s. In 1984, the Newsweek magazine declared the year of the yuppie. Yuppies were young, urban professionals whose values shaped American culture. Unlike the hippies of the 60s, yuppies were seen as materialistic and image conscious, liberal on some issues but conservative economically. And some yuppies were actually former hippies who became businessmen. So the 1980s saw this stark divide between those who prospered and those who suffered. And the yuppie culture reflected the economic inequality during the Reagan years. So his, attempts at regulating the economy just led to more division ultimately. During his presidency, conservative think tanks and policies were promoted. The Heritage Foundation was launched in 1973 and became the intellectual arm of the conservative movement. It produced policy papers and recommendations for conservative politicians. And the recommendations often focused on shrinking the federal government. And several authors were authors of various things that this foundation published were recruited to work in the White House. So we see a big jump in in the promotion of conservative Christian family values. 61% of evangelical Christians voted for Reagan in 1980. And they were a large force during this time. And they believed that issues like abortion, feminism, and a moral culture threatened traditional family values. So Reagan used the family values rhetoric, but was often flexible on specific issues. In the early 1980s, we see the beginning of the AIDS crisis. The AIDS crisis was a wave of young gay men dying from rare cancers and pneumonia. The disease was initially called gay cancer and then GRID, and in 1983, scientists discovered the disease was caused by HIV. The religious right group viewed AIDS as a divine punishment for homosexuality, and the president did not publicly mention the crisis until 1985. He did not deliver a major speech on AIDS until 1987, and he kind of buried it under the rug. The gay community had to organize its own response to get protection and medical treatment for young gay men who were contracting this disease. And this pink triangle over here on the left became a symbol of resistance and government inaction. There's a huge story behind this. If this is something you're interested in learning more about, there are various documentaries, and there's more on the textbook about it as well, about some details of how young gay men who were dealing with this disease were discriminated against, and the government tried to kind of ignore its existence for some years until they had no choice. It was brought to their attention very loudly. Also during his presidency, Reagan conducted a war on drugs and mass incarceration. When he took office, violent crime was reaching an all-time high, and politicians blamed crack cocaine. The president and conservatives promised a war on drugs and a getting tough on crime policies. First Lady Nancy Reagan led the Just Say No to Drugs campaign. So penalties for being in possession of crack far exceeded penalties for cocaine. States switched to the mandatory minimum sentences that were extremely long. Black and Hispanic people were arrested far more often than white people for drug crimes, and by the end of the century, the prison population had quadrupled. African Americans during this time period were 7 times more likely to be in prison than white Americans. And that's partly due to multi generation economic factors that stemmed back to discrimination at, World War II, education and housing discrimination. So the Reagan years brought both prosperity and hardship to different groups, right? In general, if you were a white conservative American, this was a good time for you. If you were not, this was maybe not as good of a time for you. His economic policy helped some, but increased inequality on others, and the war on drugs had devastating effects on minority communities. Um, so, pros and cons of the Reagan era, right? You can kind of take some time to stew on them yourself as a general historical overview, right? As many presidents, good things and bad things happened. Prosperity to some, hardship to others.